Let's now consider the process of evolution by the mechanism of natural selection. In Chapter 25 in your textbook, there will be emphasis on both the evidence and also the historical development of the ideas, and I'll consider some of that in my lecture as well. It's worth pointing out that in the 1800s, most of the progress made in understanding evolution by natural selection, which is when the ideas were first described and articulated by Darwin and Wallace and their contemporaries, was made without controlled experiments, without manipulations primarily, but using natural experiments, to use the term from the How Do Cats Fall from Skyscrapers paper that I was discussing earlier. But a combination of careful observation of patterns in nature and deduction, logical deduction from these patterns, and articulation of the predictions and the hypotheses. This is how the progress was made in understanding and developing evolutionary theory. So let's start by walking through the logic as articulated primarily by Charles Darwin, who is the most famous individual because of the thoroughness with which he described the evolutionary theory. So the logic for evolution by natural selection has a number of steps, and so let's walk through these. First, consider that individuals in some population will vary. Not all individuals in a flock of birds are exactly the same. Some will be slightly larger, some will be slightly smaller, some will have feathers that differ in some way. Not all individuals are completely identical, even within a population within the same species. And some of this variability will be heritable. Darwin fully appreciated and understood that, although this was back in the 1800s, and so this was before our understanding of genetic mechanisms and genes and so on was where it is today. Obviously, this is before DNA had been described, but it was certainly understood that offspring resembled their parents in some ways and not in others, and that the degree to which traits were inherited was already described and articulated. So Darwin fully understood that some of the variation in the traits was in fact heritable. He also appreciated that not all organisms will survive to reproduce. Not all organisms will have exactly the same number of offspring. And so what that means is that over time then, individuals with certain heritable traits can have a disproportionate representation in subsequent generations, meaning that organisms with certain, as we would describe today, with certain genetic makeups are more likely to be represented in the next generation. And so certain genes will show up in the next generation in different proportions than in a previous generation. This is referred to as natural selection, when in fact the heritable traits then provide some sort of advantage to the individual such that they leave more offspring. They're more likely to survive to have offspring in the first place, or they're more likely to have a larger number of offspring. Whatever the heritable trait is, if there is a relationship then between having that heritable trait and having more offspring, then there will be changes in the populations over time. And he described this as evolution via natural selection. So one of the outcomes of natural selection is that natural selection tends to lead to a better match between an organism and its environment. And the match between an organism and environment is described as an adaptation. And so an example of this is cryptic coloration. You can see in these pictures that it's very hard to even see the insects in these pictures because they resemble their background so closely. And so thinking about how something like this kind of cryptic coloration, cryptic meaning it's very hard to see these individuals, how something like this might evolve. And again, thinking of the 4 steps articulated by Darwin, if we assume that individuals in these insect populations vary, and some of the variation in the traits, meaning the extent to which they resemble their background, if this is heritable, And if there are differences in these insects, such that the ones that more closely resemble their background are more likely to survive and have offspring, which makes sense if you think about, well, what would stop individuals from having offspring? It's being eaten by a predator. And so if a predator is much less likely to see these individuals in the first place, if they more resemble their background, then it's clear how this could be an example of evolution via natural selection, would drive a cryptic coloration. Now, Darwin had ample opportunity to observe adaptations between organisms and their environment in a variety of different contexts, because he was a superb naturalist, and one of his most famous naturalist expeditions was a voyage he took between 1931 and 1936, as shown here on the map that is in front of you right now, which is not from your textbook. Darwin was English. He started in England. He was a naturalist on this voyage of the HMS Beagle, which is shown with this boat shown right here. And over this 5-year journey then, they went all over the world, up and down the coast of South America and around the world. Of course, the world is circular, which is why it goes off to the left and then reappears over here on the right, stopping at various places near Australia, and then around the Cape of Good Hope, and then back to South America, and then finally back to Britain after 5 years. Now, when you see pictures of Darwin, he often looks like this, but during this journey, he actually started this journey at the age of 22, and so he really wasn't much older than students in this classroom. So he was a very young man, and during this 5-year period then, he had ample opportunity to observe patterns of organisms in their natural environment. And one of the places that was particularly striking to him, let me go ahead and start up this movie here, was this group of islands called the Galapagos Islands, shown here in this movie that is playing here on the right-hand side. These are volcanic islands, so that means that they emerged as a result of volcanic eruptions, much like the Hawaiian Islands, for example. And so it's not as if they were connected to the mainland and then broke off during some sort of plate tectonic event, but rather they arose as a result of a volcanic eruption, which means, of course, that when the lava cooled, initially there was absolutely nothing on the islands. But of course, Darwin would not have necessarily known that, but he certainly was able to look at the islands and observe the flora and fauna on these different islands. And he noted a general pattern for islands, including the Galapagos Islands, which is that islands often have species of plants and animals that are highly specialized just to those particular islands. So this is referred to as being endemic. So these endemic plants and animals that are not found elsewhere, but they're similar to nearby islands or even maybe a nearby mainland. And so this suggested to Darwin that the patterns of species characteristics were in line with a scenario in which the islands had been colonized by individuals possibly from the mainland, but were sufficiently distinct and separated that over long periods of time then, and with further spread among the islands in the Galapagos, that each of the islands could actually end up with individuals that were fairly distinct, and that this could give rise to new species. And in the 1800s, there was also a growing understanding that the Earth was geologically active and was changing. I mean, nowadays, as you can see in the movie now playing on the right-hand side, we're very well aware of the fact that the surface of the planet is covered by a series of different plates, and that these are moving with respect to each other. In some parts of the world, there is spreading, as shown here on this movie right here, where plates are spreading apart. These can be areas of very active volcanic activity, or there can be other places where plates are moving with respect to each other, as shown here, where one plate is shown as sliding under the other one. And of course, down deeper within the planet, then the high temperatures are sufficiently high to actually melt rock. That's what a lava is. And here we have an example of a volcano erupting here. And of course, this is how one of the ways in which volcanic islands can be generated, which is why we see formation of volcanic islands very close to edges of tectonic plates. So in the 1800s then, there was a greater understanding of the changing features of the Earth, and so it was no longer assumed, as it had been earlier, that all of the geographical features of the Earth were static and had been unchanged in perpetuity. There was greater appreciation that changes might be slow, or were often slow, but over long periods of time, these changes can be vast.